The call sounded ordinary at first. A grocery store in Hillsborough, North Carolina had reported a woman stealing food, and by the time 2 officers were sent out, it looked like the case was already halfway solved. The manager had watched her leave, followed her into the parking lot, and written down the license plate as she drove away. It should have been simple. Find the woman, make the arrest, file the report, move on. But the moment officers Keith Bradshaw and Candace Spraggins pulled up outside that house, something about the scene felt wrong. They had not even turned on the siren, yet the woman inside already seemed to know why they were there. Through the window they could see movement, nervous and frantic. By the time they reached the door, Teresa West was terrified. She was 44 years old, shaking, and crying before either officer had said much of anything. She knew they had her. She had seen the store manager take down her plate when she sped off. Now the police had arrived, and in her mind, there was only one ending left. She was going to jail. The theft itself was small. Bread, meat, pasta, sauce, and a few salad items. Altogether, around $34. Hardly the kind of crime that makes headlines. But standing in that doorway, with West trembling in front of them, the officers could already tell this was not going to feel like a routine shoplifting case. West lived there with her 9-year-old son and her 19-year-old daughter. At the time, 2 of her daughter's friends were staying there too, which meant there were even more people inside the house depending on what little food they had. And that was exactly what caught the officers off guard. West was crying so hard she could barely explain herself, but the truth came out in pieces. No one in the house had eaten properly in days. That was the moment the call changed. Until then, Bradshaw and Spraggins had been dealing with a suspect. Now they were standing in the middle of something far more painful. West was not stealing alcohol, electronics, or cash. She had stolen ingredients for dinner. She had taken food because the people in her home were hungry and she had nothing left to give them. The officers stepped inside, and what they found only made the scene heavier. The kitchen told the whole story before West even finished speaking. The fridge was almost empty. The cupboards were bare. There was no hidden stash, no extra food pushed to the back, no sign that this was someone gaming the system. The only real groceries in sight were the stolen ones. In fact, West had already started preparing a spaghetti meal when the officers arrived. The food from the store was meant to be dinner that night. And suddenly the question was no longer what she had done. It was how desperate someone has to be to risk arrest for pasta, bread, and sauce. West explained that she was disabled and unable to work. She suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, and she also had brain damage from a past car crash. Whatever stability she may once have had was gone. She was struggling to care for her children and the other kids staying under her roof, and she had reached the point where hunger had cornered her into making a choice she knew could ruin her. She admitted she had panicked. That honesty hit hard. There was no defiance in her voice, no excuse, no attempt to play innocent, only fear and exhaustion. She knew she had stolen the food. She knew the officers had every right to arrest her, and yet that did not make the situation any easier for the 2 people standing in her kitchen. Because the law was clear, but so was the suffering. Bradshaw and Spraggins still had a job to do. Whatever sympathy they felt, they could not simply pretend the theft had not happened. Spraggins told West they would have to arrest her, and those words seemed to break what little strength she had left. West was taken into custody and brought back to the police department. From there, she was scheduled to appear before a magistrate. It could have ended right there. Another minor theft, another booking photo, another struggling person pushed further down by a bad decision made on a desperate day. But what happened next is the part that neither officer would forget. At the hearing, West was overwhelmed. She cried so hard that Spraggins, the same officer who had arrested her, stepped forward and handed her tissues. That alone said something. This was no longer a clean line between police and suspect. The human reality of the case had pushed its way into the room. And then Spraggins did something even more unusual. She told the magistrate what she and Bradshaw had seen inside the house. She explained that the family had not eaten in 3 days. She described the empty kitchen. She made sure the court understood that this was not a simple story of theft. It was a story of hunger. The room changed. The magistrate was moved. What he heard clearly affected him, because instead of treating West like just another defendant, he responded like a human being first. He called his mother and reportedly told her this woman needed food. Not later, not next week, right away. West was released on unsecured bail, and help began forming around her almost immediately. But Bradshaw and Spraggins were not done. While West was still dealing with the shock of her arrest and hearing, Bradshaw had started calling local charities and churches, trying to find food assistance fast. That search led to another frustrating reality. Food help existed, but not always when people needed it. The local food banks distributed supplies only on certain days, and that day was not one of them. In other words, even after seeing the family's condition with their own eyes, the officers could not quickly plug them into the normal system. And that left them with a choice: walk away and say they had done all they could, or step in themselves. They chose the second option. Bradshaw and Spraggins got back in the car and drove to Walmart. There was no camera crew, no public announcement, no reason to think anyone beyond that family would ever know. They went because they had seen hungry children in a home with nothing to eat, and they could not ignore it. Inside the store, they moved aisle by aisle, filling a cart the way parents would. Fruit first, then meat, then vegetables, then drinks for the kids. They did not just grab random items. They thought about what a family might actually need: apples, oranges, bananas, a big bag of potatoes, green beans, bacon, chicken, hot dogs, pork chops. They picked up enough to turn an empty kitchen into one that could feed people again. They even paused over drinks, trying to guess what the children might like. Dark soda or light soda? Better get both. It was such a small detail, but it revealed how deeply the call had gotten to them. They were no longer thinking as officers handling evidence. They were thinking as people trying to restore some dignity to a struggling household. By the time they finished, they had spent around $140 of their own money. Then they drove back to West's house and carried the bags inside. This is the moment where the story could have become predictable, but it did not. Because the real power of what happened came when West returned home. She walked back into her kitchen expecting the same empty floor, the same hopeless silence, the same fear that had followed her all day. Instead, she found grocery bags everywhere. The floor was covered with food, real food, enough to feed her family, enough to make the house feel alive again. For a moment, she could only stare. Then, she broke down. She cried, overwhelmed by the sight of it and by the fact that the same two officers who had put handcuffs on her had also chosen to help her. She thanked them again and again, stunned by a kindness she had not expected after one of the worst days of her life. And right there, the story took on a deeper weight. Because this was never only about groceries. It was about what happens when authority meets desperation and chooses compassion without abandoning accountability. West was still facing the consequences of stealing. That had not disappeared. But Bradshaw and Spraggins refused to let punishment be the only thing this family received. They saw the crime, but they also saw the crisis behind it. That balance is what made the story spread. Once the police department shared what had happened, people reacted strongly. The chief praised the officers' actions, and the department explained that real police work is not always clean and simple. Sometimes it is not just about catching someone. Sometimes it is about seeing the bigger problem standing behind the crime. The public response was immediate. People began offering help. The story reached far beyond Hillsborough. Readers and viewers were struck by the image of two officers arresting a woman for stealing food, then buying groceries for her family out of their own pockets. It challenged the usual script. It reminded people that not every call ends with anger, force, or distance. Sometimes it ends with understanding. But even that was not the end of the tension. Because however uplifting that act of kindness was, West's larger situation did not magically disappear. She was still poor, still disabled, still trying to support children with almost nothing. And she was still facing criminal charges. That gave the story a painful edge. The groceries helped in the moment, but they did not erase the reality that brought her there in the first place. West herself did not hide from what she had done. She admitted it. She apologized. She said what many people in desperate situations are too ashamed to say out loud. Her kids were hungry, and she did something illegal because she felt trapped. That admission is what makes the story linger. It forces people to sit with a difficult question. At what point does need become so severe that fear of the law loses to fear of watching your family go without food? Most people like to believe they would never cross that line. But hunger has a way of changing every calculation. It strips pride away. It narrows the world until all that matters is getting through the next meal, the next night, the next day. And the officers understood that once they stepped into her house, they had shown up expecting a thief. They found a mother at the edge of collapse. That is why this story stayed with them, not because the crime was large, but because it was heartbreakingly small. $34. That was the price of the theft. Such a tiny number on paper. Yet behind it was an entire household in distress, children with empty stomachs, and a woman whose body and circumstances had left her with almost no way out. In a way, the most suspenseful part of this story is not the arrest or the courtroom. It is the slow reveal of how close that family was to the brink. First the call, then the tears, then the empty shelves, then the realization that the meal she had stolen was already cooking when police arrived. Each detail made the truth harder to ignore. And the truth was simple. This was hunger, not greed, not thrill-seeking, not some clever scam. Just hunger. In many places, food insecurity is never far from the surface. One missed paycheck, one injury, one medical problem, one emergency expense, and everything can start collapsing. For people already struggling, even temporary setbacks become disasters. A disabled mother with children in the home does not need much bad luck before she is staring at empty cupboards. That was the part that troubled people most. If Bradshaw and Spraggins had not responded the way they did, Teresa West might have become just another case number. Another defendant in a courtroom. Another woman judged for stealing groceries. Instead, because the officers looked closer, the story exposed the human emergency that had been hiding beneath the charge. It also showed something important about compassion. Real compassion is not soft or blind. It does not pretend wrongdoing did not happen. It sees the wrongdoing clearly and still asks what pain produced it. That was the difficult line the officers walked. They enforced the law, but they refused to stop there. They saw that justice without humanity would leave this family even more broken than before. When West came home to those bags on the floor, she was not just receiving food. She was receiving proof that someone had seen her misery and not turned away from it. After all the fear, shame, and humiliation of being caught, arrested, and brought to court, that mattered. The image of those groceries covering the kitchen floor says more than a long speech ever could. It was a quiet answer to a brutal question. What do you do when the person you arrest is also the person who clearly needs help? In Hillsborough, on that day, 2 officers answered by doing both parts of the job. They made the arrest, and then they fed the family. That is why the story spread. That is why people remembered their names. And that is why the call that seemed routine at the start ended up affecting them so deeply. Because when they knocked on that door, they thought they were responding to a theft. By the time they left, they had stared directly into the reality of poverty, and it changed the meaning of everything they had just done. Some stories stay with people because they are shocking. Others stay because they are painfully human. This one was both.